The room smelled of stale coffee and cheap laminate. A projector hummed, casting a grid of perfect houses onto a screen. Little green squares for lawns, a winding blue line for a decorative creek. The developer's representative, a man named Hayes with a sharp suit and an easy smile, was concluding. His voice was smooth, practiced. It was the sound of inevitable progress. He pointed a laser at a red line snaking along the edge of the proposed development. A road. It looked like any other road on a planning map. An artery for the new lifeblood of the county. Tax revenue, he had called it. Opportunity. The 3 county commissioners on the dais nodded slowly. They had heard this presentation or one like it a dozen times before. It was the way of things. A farm becomes a subdivision. A field becomes a cul-de-sac. The chairman, a man with a soft middle and tired eyes, picked up his gavel. A formality. He cleared his throat to speak, to call the vote that would change the shape of the valley forever. A voice came from the back of the room. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was calm, measured, and utterly disruptive. Stop the vote. The chairman paused, gavel in midair. Heads turned. The quiet murmur of assent among the half-dozen attendees ceased. There, standing near the door, was a man who did not belong in a room of suits and zoning regulations. He wore clean work boots, laced tight. His denim shirt was pressed, but the cuffs were frayed with a history of labor. Dust seemed to be a permanent part of the fabric's weave. His hands, resting on the back of a chair, were weathered, the knuckles thick. He was older, his face a map of sun and wind. In the crook of his left arm he held a long cardboard tube, the kind used for posters or blueprints. Hayes, the developer's man, turned with a patient smile. The kind of smile reserved for a child who has interrupted adult conversation. "Who is this?" the smile asked. The chairman squinted. He knew the face but couldn't place the name. Silas Croft. The man spoke his own name into the silence. He lived on the land bordering the proposed access road. That red line on the screen. The chairman leaned toward his microphone. "Mr. Croft, the public comment period for this project closed 2 weeks ago. We are now in the final approval phase. I'm afraid the time for discussion has passed." Silas Croft took one step forward. He wasn't addressing the chairman. He was looking at the slick, smiling man in the suit. "That road was never public," he said again. Each word was laid down carefully, like a stone in a foundation. Hayes let out a small, almost silent laugh. Puff of air. "Sir," he said, his tone softening into a performance of respect. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but we have done our due diligence." He gestured to the screen where the map glowed. "That is County Road 7B. It has been on the official county plat since the 1987 survey. It is, by every legal definition, a public right-of-way. Our entire access plan depends on it. And it is perfectly, unequivocally legal." The commissioners nodded again, the brief disruption seemingly handled. The truth was on the screen, projected in crisp digital lines. A fact. Silas Croft said nothing. He simply walked forward. Slow, controlled. He walked past the other landowners, their faces etched with a familiar, defeated anxiety. He walked toward the long table at the front of the room where the commissioners and the developer sat. The room went quiet, not in anticipation of an argument. It was the quiet of curiosity, the quiet that precedes a minor, confusing event. He placed the cardboard tube on the table. The sound it made on the polished wood was soft, but it echoed in the stillness. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He had already said all he needed to say. Now he would let the paper speak. For him, the conversation had begun 28 years earlier, in a dusty attic with the woman he loved. And it had been rekindled 3 weeks ago, at a kitchen table, under the lonely glare of a single light bulb. To understand why Silas Croft was standing in that room, you have to go back. Not just 3 weeks, but 28 years, to the summer of 1994. It was a dry year. The fields were the color of straw by August. Silas's father had passed that spring, leaving behind a house full of memories and a shoebox full of papers. One Saturday, with the windows open to a heat that promised no rain, Silas and his wife, Mary, sat on the floor of the attic. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slanting through the single window. They weren't looking for anything in particular. They were just sorting through a life. Old tax receipts, a baptismal certificate, warranties for appliances long since gone to the dump. Mary pulled out a folded sheaf of papers, brittle and yellowed at the creases. It was a deed, the original one from when Silas's grandfather had bought the farm. The year was 1922. The language was flowery, full of wherefores and heruntus. Tucked inside was a surveyor's map, drawn in India ink on heavy linen paper. It was a beautiful thing. The lettering was elegant, the property lines drawn with a confident, steady hand. Unlike the sharp, computer-generated maps of the present, this one had character. It showed the creek, the old oak that had fallen a decade ago, and the small dirt track that ran along the southern edge of their property. Mary traced the track with her finger. "The Pickers Road," she said softly. "That's what your father always called it." Silas nodded. It was the road the migrant workers used during harvest season, moving from his grandfather's orchard to the neighbor's fields and back again. It connected the farms, a private artery of shared labor. It was never meant for cars. It was never meant for the public. On the old map, it wasn't marked as a county road. It was just a thin, unnamed line. But it was the handwritten note on the attached deed that Mary noticed. She read it aloud. "Use of the southern access track is granted for agricultural purpose only, by and for the adjoining parcels, and shall not be construed as a public dedication." It was signed by his grandfather and the original owners of the 3 neighboring farms. A simple agreement between men of their word, notarized with a faded purple stamp. They looked at each other. It was an interesting piece of history, a curiosity. They folded the papers carefully and put them back in the shoebox, along with a picture of Silas's parents on their wedding day. The box went into a closet. Life went on. The harvests came and went. The seasons turned. They raised a daughter. They grew older. The Pickers Road was still there, mostly overgrown, used only by Silas on his tractor a few times a year. The world forgot it, or so he thought. 3 weeks before the county meeting, a certified letter arrived. A notice of public hearing. A company called Creekwood Estates LLC proposed a development of 200 homes. Silas looked at the enclosed map. He saw the grid of new houses, the artificial ponds, and he saw the red line, their proposed access point, drawn right over the old Pickers Road. It was labeled County Road 7B. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. He didn't sleep that night. Around 2 in the morning, he went downstairs, the old floorboards groaning under his weight. He went to the closet and got the shoebox. He sat at the kitchen table where he and Mary had shared thousands of meals. He spread the old deed and the linen map under the light. He looked at the careful handwriting from 1922. He looked at the slick, printed notice from the county. The 2 documents told 2 different stories. One was a memory. The other was an assumption. Silas knew that in rooms like the one he would soon be in, assumptions, when printed on official paper, were stronger than memory. Unless you had proof. He spent the next 3 weeks in the county records office. He sat for hours, scrolling through microfiche, pulling dusty plat books from shelves. He was a man looking for a mistake. Not a conspiracy, not malice, just a simple error, made by a tired clerk or an indifferent surveyor decades ago, that had been copied and recopied year after year, until it became an accepted fact. He found it in a ledger from 1987. A survey, commissioned by the county to update its maps for a new 911 system, had simply labeled the track County Road 7B. There was no record of a public dedication, no record of a purchase, no record of the original covenant being extinguished. The surveyor had just seen a road and given it a name. And for 35 years, that mistake had been the truth. Silas made a copy of the ledger page. He put it with his grandfather's deed and the old linen map. He rolled them all together and slid them into the cardboard tube. He was ready. This wasn't about money. The developer would have surely paid him well for the land or the easement. It wasn't about a grudge against progress. Silas understood that the world changed. Fields grew houses. It was the way of things. But this was about something else. It was about Mary. She had passed 4 years ago, in the same house where she had raised their daughter, in the same bed she had shared with him for nearly half a century. Her decline had been slow, a fight waged with quiet dignity against a disease that showed no mercy. In her last few months, when she was too weak to walk far, they would sit on the porch in the evenings. She loved to watch the sun set over the south field, the field bordered by the Pickers Road. She never spoke of her fear. She spoke of the land. "Remember when we planted those pines along the fence line?" She would say. "They're taller than the barn now." Or, "The Queen Anne's lace is thick on the road this year." She saw the place not as acreage or an asset, but as a collection of memories. A living thing they had tended together. One evening, her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't let them break it up, see? Don't let them cut it into pieces." It was less a request and more of a final wish. He had taken her hand, felt frail in his own. "I won't," he had promised. "I'll keep it whole." That promise was the reason he was standing in this room. The development wasn't just a grid of new houses to him. It was a violation. That road, County Road 7B as they called it, was the first cut. It was the beginning of the breaking. The developer saw a line on a map, a convenient point of entry. Silas saw the path where he and Mary had walked after dinner, her hand in his. He saw the spot where she had pointed out a rare wildflower one spring. He saw the dust kicked up by his father's old truck. To them, it was a legal technicality to be exploited. To him, it was sacred ground. He wasn't fighting for a property line. He was fighting for a memory. He was keeping a promise. Some men collect problems. He collected patience. He had waited quietly for the right moment to spend it. And now, as he stood before the commissioners, that moment had arrived. The men in the room saw an old farmer with a dusty map. They didn't see the weight of the vow he carried. They didn't understand that he wasn't there to argue. He was there to bear witness to a truth they had all forgotten. A truth written in faded ink on a piece of paper that smelled of time and cedar and the conviction of men long dead. Silas slowly untied the string on the end of the cardboard tube. He slid the rolled papers out. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He was a man who had spent his life working with his hands, and they knew their task. He unrolled the linen map first. The paper was thick, softened by age. It lay flat on the table, a pale, creamy yellow against the dark wood. The black India ink of the survey lines was still sharp, a testament to the quality of the materials and the care of the man who drew it. The room was silent, watching this small piece of theater. Hayes, the developer's man, stood with his arms crossed, a faint, condescending smile on his face. He saw an artifact, a piece of nostalgia. He did not see a weapon. The chairman leaned forward, peering at the old map. "It's a lovely piece of history, Mr. Croft, but I'm not sure what it proves." Hayes stepped in, his voice smooth and authoritative. He was on his home turf now, procedure and precedent. "Sir, with all due respect to your family history, this map is legally irrelevant." He gestured again to the glowing screen behind him. "The official document of record is the 1987 plat map, filed and recorded with the county clerk. Subsequent filings supersede all prior, unrecorded agreements. That is a foundational principle of property law." He looked at the commissioners as he said this. It was a small lesson delivered for their benefit. He was the expert. Silas was the amateur. Silas did not look at Hayes. He did not look at the commissioners. He looked at the map. He placed a single, calloused finger on the thin line representing the Pickers Road. Then he laid the second document next to the map. It was the original deed. He opened it to the page with the handwritten covenant. The ink was a faded brown, the cursive elegant but clear. He tapped his finger next to the words Mary had read aloud all those years ago. The words about agricultural purpose only. He still said nothing. A pause. The air in the room was thick with unspoken rules. The rule that said the new map was always better than the old one. The rule that said the man in the suit knew more than the man in the work boots. The rule that said progress had its own momentum, and a piece of old paper could not stand in its way. Hayes could feel the momentum shifting back in his favor. He decided to press his advantage, moving to his second line of argument. The greater good. Mr. Croft, he said, his tone now one of concerned reason. Let's set aside the legal debate for a moment. This Creekwood Estates project represents a $12 million investment in this community. It means dozens of construction jobs. It means hundreds of thousands of dollars in new annual tax revenue for our schools, for our roads. Are you suggesting we should jeopardize all of that for the sake of an unrecorded, century-old note on a deed? He was no longer talking to Silas. He was talking to the commissioners, to the idea of civic duty. He was framing Silas's objection as selfish, as a small man standing in the way of a large benefit. One of the commissioners, a real estate agent in his other life, nodded slowly. He understood this argument. It was the language of commerce. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait. He simply pulled a third document from his tube. It was a modern paper, a photocopy. The copy of the page from the 1987 county ledger. He laid it next to the other two. 3 pieces of paper. 1922. 1987. Today. A story in 3 acts. The 1987 filing was based on an error, Silas said, his voice still low and even. He spoke to the table, not the room. This ledger shows the redesignation of the road. But it cites no public dedication hearing. It cites no instrument of conveyance. It cites no court order extinguishing the prior covenant. The surveyor made an assumption, and the county has been copying that assumption for 35 years. He looked up for the first time, his eyes meeting the chairman's. An assumption doesn't become true just because it's old. Hayes's smile was gone. This was not going as planned. The farmer had done his homework. He moved to his third and final argument, the last refuge of a man whose position is weakening. A veiled threat. Sir, challenging a recorded plat is a serious legal matter. My client has a team of attorneys who will defend their position vigorously. The cost of such a challenge could be substantial. He let the word hang in the air. He was reminding Silas that he was one man, and they were a corporation. They had deeper pockets. They could bury him in motions and legal fees. It was a sound strategy. It usually worked. But it was based on the assumption that Silas's motivation was financial, that he could be scared off by the prospect of losing money. It was the wrong assumption. Silas looked at the man, a flicker of something, not anger, but perhaps pity in his eyes. He spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The road is not for sale. It was a simple statement of fact, not a negotiating position. It was the end of the conversation. The room was now utterly still. The commissioners looked at each other, then at Hayes, then at Silas. The confident narrative had been fractured. The slick presentation on the screen now seemed flimsy, unreal. The 3 pieces of paper on the table, old, yellowed, and authentic, felt more real, more solid than the glowing pixels. The chairman, a man who disliked complication, looked around the room for a lifeline. His gaze fell upon a man sitting quietly in the corner, a man who had not spoken a word. Mr. Abernathy. He was the county records custodian. He had held the position for 40 years. He was a small, stooped man with thick glasses and a cardigan sweater, even in the summer. He was 2 years from retirement. He was the keeper of the county's memory, the guardian of its ledgers and plats. Abernathy, the chairman said, his voice betraying his relief at being able to pass the decision to someone else. Could you take a look at this? Mr. Abernathy stood up slowly. Every person in the room watched him. He walked to the front table, his shoes making no sound on the thin carpet. He did not look at the developer's glowing screen. He went straight to the paper Silas had laid out. He picked up the old deed first, handling it with a gentle reverence. He read the covenant. His lips moved silently. He then looked at the linen map tracing the same line Silas had. Finally, he looked at the photocopy from his own 1987 ledger. He stared at it for a long time, The silence stretched. Hayes began to tap a pen on his legal pad, a nervous, rhythmic tick. He stopped when he realized everyone could hear it. Mr. Abernathy set the papers down. He turned not to the chairman, but to a set of tall, metal filing cabinets against the wall. The archives. He pulled open a heavy drawer, the sound of metal rollers loud in the quiet room. He ran a bony finger along the tops of massive, bound volumes. He pulled one out. It was huge, bound in faded black leather. The words County Plats 1910 to 1930, embossed in gold on the spine. He carried it back to the table and laid it open. The book smelled of dust and time. He flipped through the heavy pages, each one a map like Silas's, a hand-drawn record of the county's past. He stopped on a page dated 1922. It was the original recorded plat of the subdivision of farms in that part of the valley. He ran his finger down the page, comparing it to Silas's map. They were identical. Then he turned to the index at the back of the volume. He was looking for any record of a change, a sale, a public dedication for that specific strip of land. He found nothing. He closed the massive book. The sound was a soft thud, a final sound. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief from his pocket. He put them back on. He looked at the chairman. His voice was dry, dusty, like the records he kept. He spoke one decisive sentence. Mr. Croft is correct. The covenant from the 1922 deed was never extinguished. The 1987 plat map recorded a descriptive name, not a legal status. The road is, and has always been, a private agricultural easement. That ended it. There was no appeal. Abernathy was not a lawyer or a judge, but in this room, his word on the county's records was absolute. He was the neutral verifier, the quiet competence that broke the deadlock. He had spoken the truth. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that follows the breaking of a spell. The easy confidence fell away from Hayes's face. It was replaced by a tight, controlled mask of professionalism, but his eyes showed the shock. He had walked into the room expecting a routine approval. He had built a $12 million project on an assumption, and a quiet man with a cardboard tube had just dismantled it. He turned to his client, a younger man in a suit who had been silent the entire time, and they had a short, whispered conference. The smiles were gone. The posture of inevitable progress was gone. Hayes approached Silas, his tone now completely changed. It was soft, conciliatory. Mr. Croft. He cleared his throat. Perhaps we were hasty. My client and I would like to discuss a new arrangement. We are prepared to make a very generous offer to purchase a new, formal easement for the road. We understand its importance to you, and we will compensate you accordingly. Silas looked at the man. He saw no understanding in his eyes, only calculation. The man still believed this was about a number. He was trying to find the price. Some things are planted for the next man, Silas thought. His grandfather had planted that covenant, not for himself, but for a future he couldn't see. Silas was now the next man, and it was his turn to tend to it. It's not for sale, he said again. The words were the same, but they landed differently now. Before, it had been a statement of defiance. Now it was a statement of fact, backed by the county's own history. Hayes tried a different angle, a desperate final pivot. Of course, I understand. What if we were to redraw our plans? We could reroute all construction traffic. We would pave the road for your private use only. We would plant a significant privacy buffer of mature trees. Your property would be entirely untouched, more valuable even. He was offering gifts, trying to bargain. He still did not understand. He was trying to buy something that had no price. No, Silas said. Just that one word. No words. No hesitación. He began to gather his papers from the table. The negotiation was over. It had never begun. He had not come to bargain. He had come to correct the record. The record was now corrected. His work was done. The resolution was as quiet as the man who had forced it. There was no gavel, no triumphant declaration. The chairman, looking immensely relieved to be out of the middle of the conflict, simply looked at Hayes. Given the new information regarding the legal status of the access road, This matter is tabled indefinitely pending a full title review. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. The project was dead. A development of that size could not be built without reliable public access. Finding a new route would take years and millions of dollars they did not have. It was over. Hayes nodded curtly. He snapped his leather briefcase shut. The click was loud in the silent room. He did not look at Silas. He and his client stood and walked out, their faces blank. They had been beaten not by a better lawyer, but by a better historian. The other landowners in the room, the ones who had come expecting to be told their fate, slowly began to stand. A few of them looked at Silas, a nod of deep, unspoken gratitude. They offered no handshakes, no backpats. They understood that this was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment of quiet restoration. They filed out, leaving Silas alone at the front table. He carefully, methodically, rolled the old linen map around the deed and the photocopy. His hands were steady. There was no trace of a tremor. He slid the roll back into the cardboard tube and tied the string. He had brought one piece of evidence the room had not seen, and it had been enough. He picked up the tube, turned, and walked out of the room. The scrape of his chair on the floor was the last sound he made. He did not look back. The glowing map of Creekwood Estates was still on the screen, a ghost of a future that would never arrive. Some men collect grievances. Silas Croft collected patience. And on that day his patience had borne fruit. He had kept his promise. The land would remain whole. That evening, Silas stood by the fence line at the edge of the south field. The sun was low, casting long shadows, turning the dry grass to gold. He looked down the Pickers Road. It was just 2 tracks of dirt, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. To anyone else, it was nothing, a forgotten path. To him, it was a monument. He leaned the cardboard tube against a fence post. He didn't need to look at the papers inside anymore. He knew what they said. He could feel the evening breeze, cool on his face. He thought of Mary, of her hand in his as they walked this very path. He had not won a victory. He had prevented a desecration. He felt not triumph, but a quiet, profound peace. Done. In a quiet corner of West Texas, a different kind of inheritance sits in a bank's safe deposit box. It's not a deed, but a set of old, brass keys that don't seem to open any known door, and a single, paid utility bill from 1954 for a property that no longer exists on any map. A young woman, the last of her line, is about to find out what those keys protect, and why a powerful oil company has been trying to buy them for 70 years. Stay with us. We'll see what holds.